You have no idea what an answered prayer that is. Graham and I have known each other a long time, and I've been praying for his salvation for years, since high school. And we would check in. It wasn't that long ago. Who made that noise? We'd meet up for conversations once every few years when he'd have God questions, and it's just unbelievable. So if you are interested in taking that step, if baptism is something the Lord is calling you to or putting on your heart, there's different ways to let us know so that we can have a conversation about that. There's cards on the back of the chair in front of you. Also, if you go on our app, you can indicate such on our app. You can sign up and we can have a conversation about that, about taking that step. It's such a huge celebration. We've already got a number of you signed up in coming weeks, so we're very excited about it. And still praising God for yesterday. Saint Ignatius of Loyola was a 16th century Spanish priest and theologian who wrote extensively about the call to follow Jesus. He wrote a famous work called Spiritual Exercises, and in it, he describes a state of being that is almost impossible to accurately translate into English. The concept has come to be called Ignatian indifference, which is a mouthful. Scholars and translators have wrestled. They've tossed about different words trying to accurately replace the one that we translate indifference simply because that sounds negative. He didn't mean it negatively. They've tried apathy, detachment, even freedom, but all of them seem to have a bit of a negative connotation to them. And his idea was quite positive. To him, human freedom in reality is a freedom to grow in our relationship with God as we journey with Jesus. This requires a bit of an internal freedom that he refers to as indifference or detachment or apathy, holding things loosely, being detached from people or things or experiences that either help us or don't help us as we pursue God. In his words, praise, revere, or serve God. In other words, it's the capacity to let go of what doesn't help me and to cling to what does. You might notice in famous artwork, by the way, around this time period, that often the great characters of the Bible, saints, even Jesus himself, they're depicted with this blank look of serenity. It looks like they've kind of checked out or they're not smiling or joyous. Everybody looks quite serious back then. You may have noticed this before. We often forget when we look at art, especially across time periods, that we're having a cross-cultural experience. Like, art is depicted differently in time. Case in point, your grandparents, if you've ever looked at photographs of them, likely they're not smiling. You look at things from the Civil War era, everyone looks quite morose and quite upset with life, right? And you kind of go, Grandpa, what's wrong? Like, smile a little bit. Well, smiling wasn't really a thing until recently in photographs, unless you're a rock star. Like, smiling is something we do now, but no one thought to do it back then. It's a cross-cultural experience. When you look at artwork from the time of Ignatius, for example, everybody has this serene look, this detachment and indifference. The goal is to convey a higher state of being. What today is known as Ignatian spirituality. It doesn't mean not caring. It just simply means being indifferent a bit, getting not too closely attached to anything. You can be deeply passionate. In fact, since God is love and his redemptive work takes place through love, you can't be indifferent in the Ignatian sense unless you love and love deeply, contemplating the beauty of sunlight, being deeply moved and grateful for my children, the delight I feel about friendship. All of this leads me to a deep gratitude, a sense of wonder and praise. But indifference in the Ignatian sense means that when the baby grows up, or when the clouds obscure the sun or the friend moves away, I can still journey on with Jesus because I've learned to hold all of it loosely with an open hand. I'm not dependent on those things for my joy, my happiness, my rest in God. I'm willing to depart with them. There's a type of serenity, of detachment, of a beautiful apathy that comes with this freedom and learning to let things go and to hold them loosely. And it's not always easy, is it? We often grab onto things. We want to carry things with us as we journey with Jesus. And it's interesting, different paradigms have different languages for these sorts of things through psychology or therapy or even religion, but all agree that at our core there's something wrong with us and we pull something in to cover that wound. Psychology calls it our attachments. Students of the Enneagram call these our core motivations or our core sins, the things deep inside we're covering for. Calvinists call them idols. Father Thomas Keating calls them our emotional programs for happiness, things that we think we need in order to live a happy and peaceful life. Different language through different paradigms that all communicate the same ache. There's things that offer to complete us. And if they don't go by the name of Jesus, all they really do is actually sabotage your soul. We're born into the world pure, but something breaks us along the way, simply by nature of it being a broken world. And we attempt to find these fig leaves to cover ourselves, to walk with. And these do well as we journey. For a bit, some do better than others. Some are celebrated by culture, career. Others we know are horrible for us. It's addiction, right? All things that seem to satisfy that ache. And as we journey with Jesus, I think we plug into him for our meaning and for our value and for our identity. And he begins to reveal to us, I think the longer we go down that road, those other things that we're trying to carry with us. Isn't that sort of the call as we follow Jesus, to always be aware of those things we're plugging into or carrying, our fig leaves, to constantly be aware of what our attachments are. As we journey more and more, we're called into a future devoid of these things. We hold everything, even good things, loosely. We can forget that nothing belongs to us. We're Jesus's. Who have I in heaven but you, God, as David prays in the Psalms. What better can I hope to find here? There comes a stage in our apprenticeship, I believe, when we're asked to journey through a milestone and let go of those things that we've been clinging to. And the story that we're going to read today, I think, describes how this is exactly what Peter's being asked to do. The Apostle Peter. If you have your Bibles, open up to John chapter 21. If you don't have a Bible, you can raise your hand. Pastor Jay there in the back will bring you one. We take seriously the idea of just looking into the books together. We could put the verses on the screen, but I'm a bit sold on this being a lost art of actually having pages where you can circle and highlight and scribble notes. The phones aren't a bad thing. What we paid extra for with these is there's no notifications that pop up, though. As you turn there, remember we've been studying the Gospel of John in 2024. And today we're concluding this gospel. It's hard to believe. It's June. We're beginning to transition in this story here from John into Peter's letters later in the New Testament. And this is on purpose. The Gospel of John ends with a conversation between Jesus and Peter. This conversation is an invitation to Peter to go on a journey with Jesus, to continue on a journey. It's a milestone, a watershed, a threshold, a pivotal moment in Peter's life, and I would argue one that all of us will come to in our apprenticeship with Jesus. So just to set the stage, where this is coming from, where we're entering into the text. Just a few chapters before this, Jesus predicted to the disciples that the authorities would arrest him, that they would interrogate him, that they would torture him. And yes, they're going to kill me, but don't worry, because on Sunday I'm going to pull off Easter. And they had no idea what that meant. And Peter emphatically and famously responds in Matthew 26. He says, Jesus, even if all else fall away on account of you, I never will. I'll never turn my back on you. And Jesus prophesies in response, truly, Peter, I tell you this very night, before the rooster crows, you've heard this story before, you will disown me 3 times. And it proves to be true. Later that same night, Peter is given 3 opportunities to affirm his faith in Jesus, his friendship with him. And each time, instead, he denies. And the last time, he's around a charcoal fire, and there he's intimidated by a middle school-aged girl. That's how great his fear is. And he's been living in this shame, in this denial, in this reality, in this hurt. Can you imagine being him? Now it's Sunday and there's rumors of resurrection. And I wonder if Peter has been living in this defeat. I wonder if he counted himself out. If the rumors are true, Jesus certainly wouldn't want to connect with him again, right? I bet this is why the angels tell Mary Magdalene when they appear to her at the tomb, go tell the disciples and Peter. Oh, he's counted himself out. He's a betrayer. He's a denier. He's a failure. But now he hears that there's a word for him. That Jesus has a spot for him, a place for him. But it's been a minute. And in this story today, he's growing restless. He's weary from the waiting. And he's returned to what's always worked for him, which is fishing. This is how John 21 begins. So if you'll read with me. After all that I just told you, afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, circle, underline, highlight, Simon told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So notice, Peter's returning to what's familiar. When we meet him, if you remember in the Gospel of John, as we've been studying it, he's a fisherman. So before his years apprenticing under Rabbi Jesus, Peter joined the family business, the family trade. And now, after these years spent apprenticing under Jesus, he's got an uncertain, unclear future. He's a bit afraid. So he returns to what's familiar. He relents. He moves backward. Verse 4, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore. But the disciples did not realize that it was him. Don't you love Jesus for this? He's doing this all the time. He's just messing with everyone. They don't know it's him. There's 3 previous resurrection appearances of Jesus. This is the 4th in the line. And in all of them, they don't know that it's him, right? He's always messing with them in that way. Concealing his identity, surprising them. And isn't this a great testimony to the fact that aren't there those moments of our uncertainty, moments of our doubt, moments of our despair and confusion, and Jesus often meets us there surprisingly? Have you ever experienced this? Somehow and you don't expect him, but he shows himself. There's a new journey, a new beginning, a new unexpected outcome. We're surprised. We're even doubtful, suspicious that it's him at all. And this story, as it's about to unfold, isn't it a case study that even when we don't think it's him, even when we think that this situation is too unimaginable, it's too unexpected for God to be here, it seems too good to be true, too fanciful for him to make an appearance, what if we can be exactly right when we go, I think that might be Jesus? Verse 5. He called out to them, friends, have you any fish? I think he knew the answer, but he made them say it. No, they answered. So he speaks to his disciples as a common greeting that working men used among themselves. He also made them have to acknowledge that they hadn't gotten anywhere with their fishing. Verse 6, he said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. You may remember a situation a lot like this from a few months before. The disciples must have flashed back to that similar experience. On that occasion, though, the net was broken and the boat began to sink. This is a familiar miracle. It's a nod from Jesus, a foreshadowing, a wink, a hint. This is me, which John picks up on right away. Verse 7, then the disciple whom Jesus loved, he says that a lot, by the way. Everyone's like, this is just a standard way of saying the guy writing this is like, I don't know, John. I feel like that's between him and. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. So, if you'll notice, John beat Peter to the tomb. He's the one that Jesus loved. He beat Peter to recognizing the fact of Jesus' resurrection before Peter. Right? We said that a few weeks ago. He spotted the identity of this stranger before Peter. He's always winning in the narrative, right? He continues to call himself the one that Peter loved. But I love that in this story, Peter's not going to let John win again. John noticed first, but Peter's like, I'm going all in. Like, he jumps in the water. He does not want John to win again. And notice, too, that he puts on his outer coat. I never caught this before. He put on his outer coat. Do you almost wonder if he thought as he got out of the boat that he might walk on water? He's done that before. Verse 9, when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals. Circle, underline, highlight, fire of burning coals. There with fish on it and some bread. You got to notice this charcoal fire. My translation this morning, it says fire of burning coals. The literal Greek phrase is anthrokarnion, and it literally means what it says, a charcoal fire. But in a day and age when real estate on papyri isn't cheap, why would John include what kind of fire this is? Right? Every editorial detail counts. It costs something. And this particular phrase, this particular type of fire is used only twice in the New Testament. The phrase appears there only twice. Here, and the other time is from Thursday night. This was the type of fire that Peter was warming himself when he denied Jesus. Did you know that the sense most closely related to your memory is the sense of smell? What Jesus is doing here is very, very intentional. He's stirring up, conjuring up sense memories of that time he failed. He's arousing in Peter what has been dogging him. He knows they have to talk about it. And what he does next, the three questions, like the three denials, that's a bit more on the nose. But this fire is so important. It's charcoal. It has a smell. And he goes, you know what, bud? We got to talk about it. When they had finished eating, you skip down to 15, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Circle, underline, highlight the these. Yes, Lord. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. Verse 17, the third time he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. So Jesus said, feed my sheep. This doesn't quite come through in the English, but it's especially poignant, I think, in the Greek. Agape love in the New Testament is the highest form of Greek love. Agape can be defined as a sacrificial, giving, absorbing love. The word has little to do with emotion. It's a choice. It's self-denial for the sake of another. It's a love that loves without changing. It's self-giving. It doesn't demand or expect repayment. It's the opposite of transactional. Transactional expects a repayment, but agape just gives because it loves to give, even to the unlovable, even to the unappealing, no matter what, because it's a choice. We're choosing agape. It's not an action, or it is an action. It's not a feeling. It's a love that loves even when it's rejected. Agape love gives and loves because it wants to. It's not motivated by what it gets in return. And of course, this is what Jesus practiced for his people. Agape love is selfless, sacrificial, and it's used all throughout the New Testament, but rarely in non-Christian Greek literature. It's a chiefly Christian idea, the kind of love Jesus has for his followers. So when Jesus asked Peter if he loves him, he's asking literally here, do you agape me? And Peter responds, I phileo you. Phileo is a lower form of Greek love, a brotherly love. It means to treat affectionately or kindly, to welcome or befriend. So Jesus says, do you love me with an all-consuming sacrificial love the way that I've loved you? And Peter, reserved in his response, answers, I am your friend. Finally, Jesus, the third time, he uses Peter's word. And instead of saying, do you agape me, he says, do you phileo me? He meets Peter where he is. So the first two times, do you agape me? I am your friend. Do you agape me? I am your friend. Do you phileo me? I phileo you. You know all things. So it's the first two answers. Peter uses a less exalted word. It's implying that he's aware, he's conscious of his own weakness. A question of, I think he doesn't know if he has what it takes to agape Jesus. Right? I think he's wrestling with that. He's caught in the tension. There's a fear there in Peter to move out into the future that Jesus is calling him into. He knows that he has a personal love and affection for Jesus, but I think he's a bit reluctant to use the word because of his past failure. He's hamstrung by it a little bit. And Jesus, he meets him where he is and attempts to pull him into this future that he's calling him into, but he doesn't want to leave him where he is, right? Peter is reluctant to use the word agape, so Jesus meets him there, but he's trying to pull him into something better. Like in his response, he's expressing he doesn't trust himself. He does trust Jesus. That's why he says, you know all things, right? You know the level of my love. This is so different from the Peter from before. Remember, boisterous, loud. He was all the time quick to assert himself and to swear these big promises, to boast big things. But this Peter, he's so weak. He's tired, he's bruised, he's vulnerable, and he's so beat up from last Thursday night that he's like, I just don't know, Jesus. I want to say I agape you. I want to say I'm capable. I want to feel like I can move out into this future that you're calling me to, but I'm not sure I have what it takes. And Jesus goes, I'll meet you there, but I'm going to pull you forward. Look what happens next. Verse 18. Very truly I tell you, Jesus says, when you were younger, circle, underline, highlight, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, circle, underline, highlight, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Peter, verse 20, did what any of us would do, turned and saw John and said, Lord, what about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You follow me. I would argue the central anchoring sentence from this entire exchange is in verse 18. This is where I want to camp out for just a minute. Jesus says, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are older, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you don't want to go. So we know that this is a prophecy, right? If you know how the story of Peter ends. But one of the most salient, shocking things about prophecy in the scriptures is not only when it's fulfilled, but when it's filled full, right? That's a defining characteristic of biblical prophecy. We see when things happen, they're fulfilled in scripture, but sometimes there are prophecies that are filled fuller. Like, for example, when Jesus tells this to Peter, we understand through the clarity of hindsight, he's making a prediction about how Peter's life will end. It's a prophetic word. As John tells us in the next verse, verse 19, he said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Jesus was speaking of his future when someone would bind him by the hands and carry him to a place he would not want to go, a place with outstretched hands where he'd be crucified on a cross. It would be by this death he would glorify God. Ancient writers tell us that 34 years after this, Peter was crucified. So this is a prediction, a prophecy, and he seemed to view it as too glorious a thing to die for Jesus the way Jesus died. And so he asked to be crucified upside down, head downwards, feet upwards. He didn't see the same posture as the Lord as being something he should get to do. Eusebius, Prudentius, Chrysostom, and Augustine all attest to this. Jerome writes he was crowned with martyrdom under Nero, being crucified with his head downwards, his feet upwards, because he alleged himself to be unworthy of being crucified in the same manner as the Lord. So these are ancient historical documents. Jesus predicted this 34 years before, in advance of Peter experiencing it. And so his prophecy was fulfilled. But isn't it interesting when prophecies become filled full? And here's what I mean. I believe Jesus is setting before us here not just a prophecy about Jesus, that's impressive, made in one moment, fulfilled 34 years later, but a paradigm for our journeys with him. A grid, a map, when you were younger, when you are older. Right? So Peter is here in this verse, at this phrase, in this scene, standing at a pivot point, a precipice between when he was younger and when he's older. By the way, we all are. It's a beach, a charcoal fire called now. When you were younger, for Peter, we're watching, he's transitioning here from being a boy to becoming a man. There's something new and different that Jesus is calling him to. And in order to move out into his future, he has to, as the Apostle Paul says, put away childish things. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he says, when I was a child, I thought like a child, I spoke as a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. So Peter's defining characteristics of when he was a child, well, for Jesus, he says, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. So some of those characteristics then just embodied under that description is there's a freedom there, right? A freedom associated with youth, a freedom associated with those earliest stages of life, and idealism and innocence, a naivety. And somewhere in there, we form these things that we cling to make us feel safe. Those attachments we spoke of a minute ago. Those securities or predictabilities or magic feathers or fig leaves. When we meet Peter, his is being a fisherman. That's who he is. At his core, that's what he's good at. It's his identity. It's what he does. It's what his family does. More, he's bombastic. He's headstrong, impulsive. He's a risk taker. More and more and more as we journey with him through the gospel, we see that he really wants to please and be like his rabbi. No disciple gets higher praise or sharper criticism than Peter. And it's like as he journeys with Jesus, Jesus calls him more and more away, not from his personality, but from the darker caricatures and characteristics of the personality to a holier one. See, I think Peter has beneath the exterior, as we all do, a shadow side, an accumulation of untamed emotions, less than pure motives, thoughts that, while largely unconscious, influence and shape his behaviors. It's the damaged and mostly hidden version of who he is, and it's like this for all of us. Right? Isn't it true? We have a strength, a light we project out into the world, and it's brilliant and beautiful, but there's a shadow side to it, almost like a backside weakness to all our strengths. Thomas Merton famously calls this your false self. And he's playing with language from the Apostle Paul. We read in the New Testament of your old self and your new self, and Thomas Merton just changes that a little bit to your false self and your true self. He says that your old self is your false self. It's a combination of those attachments that you've made, those things that you do, those habits that you have, trust structures that shape how you view the world, where you get your motivation, your approval, your identity, your value. The scriptures teach that when you come to Jesus, you're born all over again, as Jesus told a man named Nicodemus. You're moved from that old self to a new self, one that's reborn in a new world. You become new. And for some people, it's instantaneous. But for most of us, it's slow and gentle and sometimes difficult to allow God to unravel us. Isn't it? I love what Rich Mullins says. He says, on my road to salvation, I stick out my thumb and he gives me a ride. He takes us through this Jordan that we're crossing into in his eternal rest. And God does the work, but it hurts to be unraveled, doesn't it? Sometimes this unraveling is brought about by crisis. Other times it's just revealed over time as you walk with Jesus. For our friend Peter, I don't know what kind of world he was born into, but somewhere along the way, down to his core, he developed an understanding that his meaning, his value, his identity, all of this was attached to being loud and bombastic and first and esteemed, and he becomes a slave to that. And more as he's journeyed with Jesus, these 3 years, he's been called away from that. And what happened at that charcoal fire just a few nights ago, though, reminds him how frail he is. And now on the beach this morning with Jesus, he's reached a crisis point, a watershed, a threshold. Will I go back or will I go forward? Notice we already find him fishing. He's tiptoeing to that past life, isn't he? It's safe, it's predictable. In his fear and his exhaustion and his intimidation, maybe of the future, and his overwhelm, his distrust of his own heart, he's moved backward to his former identity. He starts saying phileo rather than agape. He doesn't have what it takes. But Jesus is calling him into the future, a future he has for him if he's willing to leave those former things. This is a critical moment. It's a pivot point in his life, a scene called now. Peter, when you were a child, you spoke as a child. You thought as a child, you reasoned as a child. If you want to keep following me into the future I'm calling you into, you have to be willing to put away those childish things. I'm calling you to something new. I have a future in mind for you. I'm already there, by the way. That's why I can say follow. But you're scared. You're tempted to count yourself out, to move backward. You're tempted to abandon the future and settle for your own life because it's safe and it's predictable. But the future is where I am, and I'm what you get. I know it's scary. It might even be lonely because I'm asking you to follow me. Not your stuff, not your identities, not your attachments, your feathers, your blankets, your fig leaves. You. Isn't this why Peter points to John? Well, what about him? Can I take him with me? I never noticed before how much time Peter and John had spent together in the past until my most recent reading of these Gospels, right? Of the 12 disciples, Peter and John, they're two of the closest to Jesus. 2 out of the 3 of the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. Peter and John spend so much time together one-on-one. In spring of AD 33, we find them working together in Luke 22. Jesus sends them, only them. They are the two who are sent to prepare for the Last Supper. No one else, just these guys. That same year later, we read a story in Acts 3 and 4 about a time they went to the temple. You remember this? And they healed a man on the Sabbath, and that created an uproar, and they got into a ton of trouble, right? And it's those two who are in prison together. By Acts 8, Christianity has jumped the border and spread to Samaria, and the Jesus community in Jerusalem selects John and Peter to go sniff it out and see if it's the real thing. Sometime in the late 40s and 50s, Paul wrote the letter to the church in Galatia, you remember? And in this letter, he names the 3 pillars of the Jesus community from Jerusalem: Peter, John, and James. They are very close, these two. They rubbed shoulders closely in the Gospels and even then after. So Jesus prophesies about Peter's future, and Peter, scared and reluctant and fearful, tempted to go back to his past, turns and looks at John. And you go, well, what about him? Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, and he asked, Lord, what about him? And Jesus answered, if I want him to remain until I return, what's that to you? You follow me. I think I had always seen this as comparison. Like, if I have to die, does John have to die? And maybe, but maybe it's more than just that. Maybe as Jesus is inviting Peter into a journey, which I love that phrase, by the way. When we follow Jesus, isn't that what he's doing? He's inviting us to a journey with him. And this invitation to a journey is an invitation to apprenticeship. And we journey into a future where Jesus already is. And Jesus is inviting Peter into that too. And like Peter, all of us want to know what we must give up before we go. Don't we? We weigh it out. Peter is standing at the intersection of when you were younger and when you were older. And there's fear for him about the future, and good reason for it. His when you were younger days, he made some mistakes, but it was safe at least. It was predictable. It consisted of fishing. Notice Jesus starts by asking, do you love me more than these? Is these the fishing? Do you love me more than you love fishing? Do you want to follow me into the future? Peter's been walking and shedding those layers of his false self, his shadow side, but now he's experienced Thursday night a setback, a disruption, and Jesus knows it hurts. He knows he's scared, and in his fear, he may decide to go back to what's safe, and so he sets a scene, a charcoal fire, because he knows as long as they don't talk about it, it's gonna eat away at him. And then he makes him an offer, and the offer is himself. As Dylan said last week, the reward for following Jesus is Jesus. And at this pivot point, this station between when you were young and when you were old, this crossroads called now, Jesus is inviting Peter to a journey that scares Peter. And Peter, in his fear, turns and points and goes, well, I get to at least take John with me? John's safe. Isn't it true that as we begin to journey, as we keep journeying with Jesus, as we move from younger to older, doesn't he begin to identify our Johns? Those things that we want to hang on to, those things we want to bring with us. And isn't it true more and more that as we follow Jesus, the more we begin to let go of those things? I think this is such a great way to think about our journey. It's an invitation to a journey. I meet so many people who have said, conversations with Graham before, who you just saw baptized. If I journey with it, if I surrender my life to Jesus, do I have to give this up first? And I think that's just a problematic way of thinking about it. I think more often what I like to say is I think as you journey with him, the more and more uncomfortable you'll become trying to bring that with you. And that can be anything, can't it? Lifestyle, person, pastime, career, questions. I kind of always want to say, I think you're going to be uncomfortable trying to bring that with you because that's been my experience. Those attachments we form, they serve us well when we're young, don't they? But as we journey, they can really hold us back. And Peter's tempted to run backwards. Isn't it interesting? The author of Hebrews says in chapter 12, verse 1, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. There's two categories he gives. He compares it to running a race. He said, or she, some think a female wrote the book, which there's good argument for that. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangled. Two categories, everything and then sin. Because everything that slows us down isn't always something we consider sin. It might just be stuff we're trying to bring with us. Johns that we're trying to fit into this picture, this offer that Jesus has made us. And Jesus goes, John's not on offer. I am. What's that to you? You follow me. Here's what I'm asking. I can remember entire seasons of my life where I felt the Lord calling me into a future that I tried to measure out. I wanted to know the outcome. There were things, people, that I wanted to carry with me into that next chapter. And I didn't want to make a change unless I knew they were going to make it with me. I didn't want the scene to change. I wanted to control outcomes or predict outcomes. I was Peter asking if I could bring John with me. And I felt the Lord gently say to me what Jesus says to Peter here. What's that to you? You follow me. There are so many people in Scripture. The ones who get into trouble are the ones who try to bring people with them into something God's calling them into, right? I think about Abraham in chapter 12. God says, I want you to leave your country and your family. And we're told all throughout Scripture he possessed great faith because he did it. And he did. But do you remember when God looked down and he sees the caravan, he's like, who's that dude in the back there? I thought I told you to leave everything. I did. Well, then who's that guy? Oh, that's just Lot. He lives in the garage. He's harmless. You don't understand. He's not I thought I told you to leave everybody. I did. Well, then who is that? You remember, he tried, and all the trouble that Abraham got in the book of Genesis usually is tied to trying to fit Lot into a chapter God didn't call Lot into. He called Abraham. You follow me. I'm talking to you. But if you're like me, you try to, I think Peter in the scene, he's like, do I get to bring John? Can I still fish? What do I actually have to give up? I love what Oswald Chambers says. He says the call of God becomes clear as we obey. Never as we weigh the pros and cons and try to reason it out. The call is God's idea, not our idea. And looking back over the path of obedience, do we realize what God's idea has been all along? For he sanctifies our memories. When we hear the call of God, this was so huge for me. It is not for us to dispute with him and arrange to obey him if he'll expound the meaning of his call to us. As long as we insist on having it explained, we will never obey. But when we obey, it becomes clear so that looking back, we can say, he doeth all things well. There's a promise there. And so this is where Peter finds himself, a watershed, a pivot point between future and past, between when you were younger and when you were older, a beach and a charcoal fire named now. Will you follow me into this future? When you were younger, those things that you tried to bring along with you, they worked for you. As you get older and you move into this stage of apprenticeship, I'm going to ask you to lay them down and trust me. Step out into this future that I'm already in. Put away childish things. For many of us, this is a journey into a new season, a next stage or phase of our apprenticeship. For some, we've never surrendered in the first place. For all of us, I think the call is the same, to open our hands and to journey with Jesus. As a church, we're going to continue on with Peter on Sunday mornings. We're going to study his epistles from here, follow his letters in the New Testament. We've, again, spent 24 studying John, and John's gospel closes with Peter. So now we're going to transition to following our friend Peter and discovering together how he did this. But spoiler alert, the fearful, limping, reluctant Peter from this scene, scared of opening his hands and following Jesus into the when you are older, becomes the leader of the New Testament church. And when his day comes, the one Jesus is here prophesying about, when he finds himself being dressed and being led by the hand to a place he doesn't want to go, he's so excited to do it that he goes, you're going to have to do it upside down. It's a bit of a different Peter, isn't it? But it required him to move forward into this future that Jesus was calling him into. So what is he calling you to? What's in your watershed? Or maybe maybe a good question. What's your more than these? Do you love me more than these? What's your more than these? What's your John? What's your Lot? What's your what about him? We're going to approach the table today for communion, which I think is a great way to end John. We didn't do this on purpose, but it feels so fitting. And I was also thinking this morning about how today's June 2nd is sort of a beginning, right? And as we cross into this new beginning, as we close John, as we move into this season, it seems fitting to consecrate ourselves the way we do with the Lord's table. There's this scene in Joshua chapter 3 where the Israelites are going to cross the Jordan, which is such a beautiful metaphor for our lives here, I think, right? This Jordan we have to cross that is sometimes calm, but other times so reckless and exhausting. And the Israelites, they have no idea what's on the other side of this crossing. They know there's enemies there, they know there's giants, and they're fearful. And I love what Joshua says to them. In this moment, their beach scene, he says, you have never been this way before. Guys, we've never been this way before. There's an uncertain future. The world is so different than anything we've ever lived in before. Human existence is so different, so weird. You've never been this way before. And then Joshua says, so consecrate yourselves. And tomorrow, the Lord will do miracles among you. I love that promise. So here at this watershed, as we conclude John's gospel, as we enter this season, as we cross from when we were younger to when we were older, despite the fear, the anxiety, the worry, the apprehension of the Jordan that you're crossing, the uncertainty of the other side, the things you're leaving on this side, as you journey with Jesus into this future he's created for you, where he already is, consecrate yourself. It means to set aside, to reserve yourself for God's use. God, I'm yours. And one way that he's given us to communicate that is the Lord's Supper, this table that we'll approach. It's consecration. And before we approach it, I want to stop and just allow you an opportunity to reflect. Could we close our eyes? Where are you in your apprenticeship to Jesus? Is he calling you to a when you are older? And is there fear like Peter? Is he inviting you to a journey for the first time? Has he put his finger on any charcoal fires in your life? As we continue on, we've never been this way before. And so in a moment, we'll consecrate ourselves. And before we approach these tables, let's just take a moment to pause. Where am I? Lord, what are you calling me to? After a moment, I invite you to make your way to one of these stations and take the elements, bring them back to your seats with you, and we'll partake together. Lord, examine us so that today we can consecrate ourselves and tomorrow see miracles. In 1 Corinthians 11, the Apostle Paul says, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" God, we thank you for this bread. We thank you for your Son, the sacrifice. And now we receive this as the body of Jesus broken for us. Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." Let's eat together. In the same way, Paul continues, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Jesus, we thank you for this juice. We thank you for this symbol of the blood you spilled for us, for the remission of our sins. Thank you for the sacrifice, washing us clean, bringing us peace with God. Let's partake together. Scriptures say whenever we eat this bread and drink this cup, we proclaim him until he returns. And if you've been here any length of time, you know my favorite thing to do when we finish communion. The scriptures say that original Lord's Supper, they went out from that upper room singing. And I'm like, that seems like a pretty straightforward thing for us to do too. So, y'all want to go out of here singing today? Yeah. Good, because we're gonna regardless. So, would you join us standing as we sing out to the Lord Jesus?